Ombudsman Resource Center, or NORC. Thanks for joining in this webinar for local representatives on the topic of the Long-Term Care Rule, Ombudsman Program Representative Advocacy, Training, and Program Management. Today's focus is on complaint handling and processing. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be on the NORC website, LTCOmbudsman.org, later this week, along with all the handouts. Katie, would you open the first poll, please? We'd like to find out who's with us today. So are you located in the state ombudsman office, in a local entity, or not an ombudsman? Is the poll open?
Yes, it's open.
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. I can't see them. You should have received an email with the handouts earlier today. However, they are also in the toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen down under handouts, and there are 5 of them. We built in time today for questions and answers, so please type any questions you have into the toolbox. So Katie, close the poll and let's see what the results are.
So 25% are in a state office and 75% are in a local ombudsman entity.
Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. This training is, being focused toward the local ombudsman representatives, but it's great to have the state staff and state ombudsman listening in also, because this obviously is a cooperative adventure. So Katie, could you open the second poll, please? And this poll is asking, do you provide training for other representatives, either staff or volunteers? It's our hope that you'll use the information and handouts from today's webinar to train other representatives. So we'd like to kind of know how many of you actually do the training for other representatives in the program. When the webinar today ends, you will be receiving an evaluation survey, so please take a few minutes to provide feedback in order for us to continue providing quality webinars. Okay, Katie, would you close the poll, please?
79% said yes and 21% said no.
Perfect. Well, every representative needs to know this information, whether you train other people or not. However, this is kind of a train the trainer, and so this is an opportunity to see some national materials, to put those together with materials that have been developed within your state or your program, and then make sure that everyone knows what's happening and knows how they should be conducting complaint investigations. So Katie, could you open the third poll, please? And this one asks how long you've been an Ombudsman Program representative: more than 10 years, more than 5 years to 10 years, 2 to 5 years, less than 2 years, or not applicable. So today's speakers, our first speaker will be Louise Ryan. Louise currently serves as an Ombudsman Program Specialist for the United States Administration for Community Living, Administration on Aging. Her primary duties include providing technical assistance to states on policy interpretation of the Older Americans Act and Ombudsman Program Rule regarding the operations of the long-term care ombudsman programs. Prior to coming to AOA, Louise was the Washington State Long-Term Care Ombudsman for nearly 5 years after serving as the Assistant Long-Term Care Ombudsman for 9 years. So we want to thank Louise for joining us today. Second speaker will be myself, Carol Scott. I am the Ombudsman Specialist for NORC. Prior to joining NORC last summer, I worked for the Advancing Excellence in America's Nursing Home campaign, and before that, I was the Missouri State Ombudsman. And our third speaker will be Jan Brown. Jan is a regional ombudsman from Pennsylvania. She's been an ombudsman for 13 or 14 years and has worked for an area agency on aging for 12 or 13 years. And Jan, I apologize. I was going to go back and double check those numbers and I didn't, but we're glad to have Jan with us today. So thanks also to Katie Kohler, the Program and Administrations Associate with NORC, and Amity Overall Labe, our Director of the Resource Center, for helping out and handling the technical side of the webinar. So Katie, what are the results of that poll?
So 27% have been with the program for more than 10 years, 17% have been more than 5 years, 32% has been in for 2 to 5 years, and 24% has been for less than 2 years.
Wow, well that's a great variation, and thank you to those of you who've stuck with the program. I know it's kind of one of these, you get into it and you're like, there's not a better job in the world. And for those of you that are just beginning the adventure, welcome aboard. You're in for a ride and for a opportunity to really make a difference. So the objectives, oops, that's a question. The objectives of today's webinar are to understand the complaint process responsibilities as outlined in the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Rule, and to remain focused on the rule and duties. You know, nothing really has changed with the actual role of the Ombudsman, but we are learning to be more focused on resolving and investigating complaints, in obtaining the resident's consent, knowing when and how to disclose the resident's name, and remembering that the ultimate goal is to resolve complaints to the resident's satisfaction. Please remember to type any questions that you have in the toolbox, and we'll answer them after all the speakers are done. And if you have any other questions following this webinar, please reach out to your state ombudsman or to NORC. And at this time, I will turn things over to Louise Ryan. Louise?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm waiting to have the screen.
That was me. That was me. Here I was also worried about making sure that got done, and I forgot I was doing that. My bad.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay, wonderful. And let me, I need to minimize this here. Oh, that's one thing I didn't practice doing. How do I make this minimize? It's different. Okay, well, I'm going to try to move that. There we go. Okay, excuse my technical difficulty here. Carol, how do I move? There we go. Okay, so good day, everybody. And again, my name is Louise Ryan. I'm the Ombudsman Program Specialist with the Administration for Community Living at the Office of Long-Term Care Ombudsman Programs. And thank you all for being on the call today. And I'm having another technical difficulty in getting my slides. Oh, there we go. Okay. So just a quick note about the Administration for Community Living, which includes the Administration on Aging. Our mission is to maximize the independence, well-being, and health of older adults, people with disabilities, and their families and caregivers. So we really, as an agency, work across the lifespan. And I want to kind of set the tone today to kind of start a little broadly thinking about our program's origins with our, basically the originator of the Ombudsman program, U.S. Commissioner on Aging Arthur Fleming, who said, "Our nation has been conducting investigations, passing new laws, and issuing new regulations relative to nursing homes," and we can now say also new regulations relative to the Ombudsman program. But he went on to say, if the laws and regulations are not being applied to the individual, they might just well not have been passed or issued. And we really take that to heart. And, you know, part of the intent of developing and promulgating the long-term care ombudsman rule was to really help to define and support what is in the Older Americans Act, and to support resident-directed and resident-centered ombudsman services. And I want you to think if you are an ombudsman representative, you investigate complaints, and think also just broadly of your ombudsman program, kind of what is the role of a complaint investigator from the ombudsman program. I think we want you to be viewed by the resident as a trusted, person-centered problem solver, and for residents to know that their communications are confidential, and also what you observe is confidential, that the ombudsman program is a credible source of information, and also that it's free of conflicts that might impact the effectiveness and credibility of the ombudsman program. And we think all of this supports an effective program and also a credible program. And from a resident's point of view, they might just say, well, you're the person who helps me, right? You're the person who helps solve problems. A couple quotes that I found in our NORS narratives that I wanted to share, and these are direct from residents. And you've probably heard things like this when you've helped residents to, resolve a complaint. And one resident said, as I've learned, residents do have rights. Your ombudsman can empower you so that you can exercise those rights. And another person said, if the ombudsman was not there, I don't think I would be here. So, you know the power that and the difference you make for residents. But I also want to kind of take it back to the resident who says, if I have a complaint about, fill in the blank, do I trust the ombudsman program to investigate and resolve my complaint? And one thing I like to mention and remind folks is that at the end of the day, at the end of the visit, that the representative of the office gets to go home, obviously, and the resident is still in the facility. And they're still living with the situation, with the problem, with the complaint. And, with respect to complaints about, say, abuse or neglect or exploitation, they may feel an extreme sense of fear of retaliation, sense of danger around how that, and wanting assurance in how that complaint is handled. So an example I have, based on some unfortunate experience, when I was a state ombudsman, of a complaint that came to me was a resident confided in the ombudsman program, ombudsman representative, about being harassed by the maintenance worker. And well-intended, but incorrectly, that representative of the program reported it to state licensing, who then came out and did their investigation and kind of exposed the issue. But in the meantime, that maintenance worker was still on the premises. So that resident felt even more endangered and fearful, having reported to the ombudsman. So the credibility, of course, was lost, and things did get resolved, but it was an added trauma for that resident. So it really shows the power of what can go wrong, well-intended, but what can go wrong when you don't maintain that confidentiality. The other common example that I think of is when there's, say, a family issue, a family problem, and the resident wants the ombudsman's assistance but isn't ready to disclose that to outside parties. And you may have experienced that as well. So more formally, what does the Older Americans Act law say and require of the ombudsman program with regards to complaint processing? And you've probably all seen this before, but it requires the ombudsman or representatives of the office to identify, investigate, and resolve complaints that are made by or on behalf of residents and that relate to the action, inaction, or decisions that may adversely affect the health, safety, welfare, or rights of the residents, of providers of long-term care services, public agencies, or health and social service agencies. So that's kind of our foundation for what the law requires around investigating complaints. What the rule does, and the rule kind of fills in where the law doesn't have the details, what the rule does is it clarifies the purpose of complaint resolution and it describes person-centered problem solving. It defines the Ombudsman program role related to abuse, neglect, or exploitation complaints. It also describes what to do for complaints where residents are not able to communicate informed consent, or when the ombudsman or a representative of the office personally witnesses abuse. So what do we mean by person-centered? What does the rule mean there? If you look at the Ombudsman regulation, you'll see that it really has a number of what I would call steps or action items with several goals. One being a big one being to support and maximize resident participation. And in other words, the ombudsman just doesn't go and do. They work with the resident to the degree that resident is able to participate in the identification of the problems and the resolution. This should be done in a setting that offers as much privacy as possible, and we know sometimes that can be tricky. And the representative of the office is to discuss the complaint with the resident and or the resident's representative in order to determine the perspective of the resident, request informed consent in order to investigate the complaint, determine the wishes of the resident with respect to resolution of the complaint, including whether there are allegations to be reported or disclosure of information to the facility and appropriate agencies. This also, of course, would include advising and discussing with the resident his or her rights, working with the resident to develop a plan of action to resolve the complaint, and then investigate to determine whether the complaint can be verified. And during this investigation process, working towards resolution, once you as the ombudsman representative feels the complaint is resolved, find out from the resident, one, do they agree, and what is their level of satisfaction with that resolution? So basically, that is all in the Code of Federal Regulations at 45.13.24.19 sub B. The rule also talks about abuse complaints and clarifies the Ombudsman program responsibility with respect to these types of complaints. First and foremost, the Ombudsman program serves as an advocate and problem solver for an abuse survivor. The role is not to substantiate the complaint or to prove in a kind of formal way whether suspected abuse has occurred. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little later. So it's really to work with the resident, again, to help them achieve their goals. We found that historically there's been a variation among states in handling long-term care facility abuse complaints. Most commonly, Adult Protective Services or Licensing and Survey are the state's official investigator, and the Ombudsman program serves as a resident-centered advocate and problem solver. We found there have been a few states where the Ombudsman program has been the official investigator of abuse complaints, or a few states where the Ombudsman program has referred all abuse allegations to APS and or licensing without any kind of investigation. And as the Administration for Community Living has worked with states to come into compliance with the rule, and as we've reviewed states' laws, statutes, policies, and procedures, we've identified where states have been kind of out of alignment with the requirements of the rule and asking for correction. And complaint processing has been a fairly common one for a variety of reasons. So we're working towards states all becoming more consistent in terms of their handling of complaints, that especially with regards to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So what about residents who can't consent to receive the assistance of the Ombudsman program? So the program can work with the appropriate resident representative if that resident can't communicate consent. And they also need to make sure they understand the representative's authority. So is this resident representative a guardian? Do they have durable power of attorney? What exactly is their authority? The Ombudsman program's authority to work to resolve a complaint and disclose information where a resident can't communicate informed consent and does not have a representative available is allowed, is permitted in certain circumstances. And always in those cases, the Ombudsman program works to resolve the complaint to protect the resident's health, safety, welfare, and rights, and attempts to determine whether the complaint was resolved to the satisfaction of the complainant. So when you have a representative, you can determine satisfaction a little bit easier. When you don't have someone to, either the resident or the representative, to kind of tell you the outcome, tell you they're satisfied, occasionally the Ombudsman representative will have to make that determination. But with regards to issues that you see, complaints where the resident can't speak for themselves and there's no representative, there are some extra steps to be taken, in particular with regards to sharing information with outside agencies. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So in general, the Ombudsman program can provide information to other agencies if the program adheres to the disclosure requirements. So when there is the resident or the resident representative communicates the goal for regulatory or protective services or law enforcement, then the Ombudsman program will assist the resident in contacting that agency and or disclosing information. So in other words, the resident says, I'm fed up with this situation here. I want state licensing to come in and inspect this facility and look at these care complaints that they're not resolving. They haven't listened to the Ombudsman. I want that outside party to come in and do their role. That could be where the Ombudsman may help the resident to make that referral, or they might do it on behalf of the resident. Sometimes the disclosure is to the facility representative, so it's not to maybe necessarily an outside party, but even to go talk to facility staff to resolve a problem, the Ombudsman program needs to get that consent from the resident or the representative, and they may facilitate that discussion. Occasionally, the Ombudsman might speak on behalf of the resident without the resident there, but as much as possible, you want that resident participation. So basically, disclosure in terms of resolving a complaint, when you need to talk to outside parties, you need some form of consent, right? So that consent may be verbal, It may be written, it may be through the assistance of auxiliary aids and services. If it's verbal, you need to document that consent. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about disclosure requirements, obtaining that consent to disclose, and also focusing on who are you disclosing to, an outside party or within the facility. And the Ombudsman program shall not report suspected abuse when a resident or resident representative has not communicated that informed consent, with some exceptions. So you may have had an experience where a resident tells you something that sounds like it could be abuse, could be financial exploitation, and they say don't tell anybody, and they mean it. They mean don't tell anybody. So you at that point do not share that until you keep working with that resident to get that consent. And for reasons I described earlier, the resident has a better understanding of their circumstance and what they want, and you've got to work with that. So the exceptions to disclosure. So when can the Ombudsman program disclose resident identifying information? There's a few circumstances. When there's no one available to communicate consent, for instance, the resident can't, they don't have a representative, or that resident representative has taken action to harm the resident, and the Ombudsman program has reasonable cause to believe that an action may adversely affect the resident's health, safety, welfare, or rights. There's no evidence that the resident would not wish a referral, and there's reasonable cause to believe a referral is in the resident's best interest, and the representative of the Ombudsman Office of the State Ombudsman, so that local Ombudsman representative gets the approval of the State Ombudsman or otherwise follows office policies. So similarly, with personally witnessing abuse, the program representative shall report this type of abuse under some circumstances. The Ombudsman or representative of the office personally witnesses the suspected abuse. There's no one available to communicate consent, and there's no evidence the resident would not wish this disclosure, so it's very similar, and there's reasonable cause to believe the disclosure is in the resident's best interest, and the Ombudsman, meaning the State Ombudsman, gives that approval. So there's this kind of very narrow window where we have, and I think you've all been in this situation if you're a representative of the office, where you've seen residents who seem to, maybe it's a care issue, you see there's something going on with that resident, they cannot express to you what the issues are, they can't give you consent, but you see there's something where they need some help, and you need to be able to bring that to the attention of others. And so that is where you have to get consent from the State Ombudsman to disclose that information and take action. And the State Ombudsman, when you contact the State Ombudsman has to have in their policy that they will respond to you within a certain time frame. So I did want to just give a couple of distinctions just to help. I find this chart pretty helpful. I'm not going to read it all, but it's going to for your reference. What is the difference between the Ombudsman program and Adult Protective Services with regards to abuse, neglect, exploitation types of investigations? And I think when you look at the mission, that tells you pretty quickly the difference. The Ombudsman's goal is to resolve complaints to the satisfaction of the resident and improve the quality of care and quality of life of residents, whereas Adult Protective Services, their focus is to stop the abuse, neglect, and exploitation and protect the victim, and that may or may not be in accordance with what the victim wants. And I'm going to just skip down to the purpose of the investigation. Again, the Ombudsman is not the official finder of fact. They don't substantiate the abuse, whereas the Adult Protective Services would be an official finder of fact. The Ombudsman program would verify a complaint to determine if there's sufficient information to continue towards resolution, and they, in their complaint investigation, gather information in order to resolve a problem, not for any legal proceedings. Whereas with Adult Protective Services, they're trying to determine whether the allegation occurred. They often use the term substantiate, and often if they determine a complaint issue was substantiated, it may be referred to law enforcement, quite often for prosecution. So one other big difference is within the Ombudsman program, the Older Americans Act requires systems-level advocacy, which is not a responsibility of Adult Protective Services, and it might even be prohibited in some states by their state law. I did want to point out that there's a really good discussion of a couple of questions related to mandatory reporting and abuse investigations on ACL's frequently asked questions section of our website, and I do have the link for that at the end of this presentation. So when the rule was finalized, a lot of questions came to us, and we've kind of put them, kind of just, defined the question, and then we've provided an answer. We still have more we'd like to get posted, but we have about, I don't know, around 18 questions, I think, on the FAQ list. So there's two that are relevant to this discussion. And the first question is, does the rule prohibit an ombudsman or representatives of the office from being mandated reporters under state abuse reporting laws? And the answer is yes. The rule and the Older Americans Act prohibit reporting of resident identifying information without the resident's consent. I'm not going to read all this to you, but I do want to say that this, from the very beginning, has been the intent of Congress. And as we note here, despite numerous congressional reauthorizations of the Act, Congress has never provided an exception for abuse reporting in the Act. So that's kind of the long-standing message of the Older Americans Act, and the rule then follows that. And as I read that, though, I think, well, we did have some changes in the Older Americans Act, and but in terms of mandated reporting, that has not changed. So we have found a little sliver in the rule and around reporting when a resident can't give consent, but that is very different than mandated reporting. And again, this slide here does not have the full answer on the frequently asked question, just part of it. The other question is, does the rule prohibit ombudsman programs from investigating abuse complaints? The answer is no. Both the Older Americans Act and the rule require the ombudsman program to identify, investigate, and resolve complaints that relate to action, inaction, or decisions that may adversely affect the health, welfare, or rights of residents, and certainly abuse, neglect, and exploitation fall within that. However, as mentioned before, ombudsman programs are not the official entity to substantiate or fact find for abuse complaints on behalf of the state or other government entities. So I'm just going to circle back for you to think about this again. You know, as a resident, if I have a complaint about something, do I trust the Ombudsman program to investigate and resolve my complaint? And so again, thinking of all of the issues that residents experience in terms of fear of retaliation, family dynamics, wanting to retain as much control over their life as possible. That's where your role as that trusted problem solver is critical, to be trusted and to maintain that credibility as that trusted person that the resident can share their confidences and help to direct how their problems are resolved. And here are a couple of resources, a link to the Ombudsman Rule. And you might know that the rule, when it was published, started out as 1327, and then it was later changed this past July to 1324. So this link has the correct numbers, correct regulatory citation. And then here is the link to the frequently asked questions. And thank you very much.
Louise, thank you so much. This has been very, very helpful. We want to ask for the next polling question, Katie, whether your program has changed any practices related to the complaint handling process in response to the long-term care ombudsman rule. So has your program made any changes, or I guess even if you're thinking, oh, maybe we do need to make some changes, you can put yes down, or no, have you not had to make any changes because this hasn't really changed any of the ways that your ombudsman program has been handling complaints. This would maybe developing new forms for collecting permissions or ensuring that permission is granted in cases of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Maybe new procedures for keeping the resident informed of your progress, swinging back and talking to them, and then ensuring that they are indeed satisfied with the work that's been done. So, Katie, what are the results of this poll?
49% said yes, and 51% said no.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Thank you. Not surprising that kind of in the past states have, been able and were doing work based on kind of what was happening within their own state. Even with the Older Americans Act, states had state laws that directed them to do things. I think with the advent of the new long-term care ombudsman rule, however, we'll now see that how an ombudsman works in one part of the country will become almost interchangeable with how they work in another part. So it's a good thing, and interesting that we're about 50-50 on that. So the long-term care ombudsman rule requires several things regarding the complaint investigations, establishment of policies and procedures that are related to the promptness in responding to complaints, access to records necessary to investigate complaints, and disclosure of identifying information of a resident. NORC is in the process of developing a training guide to assist you in getting the word out to all of your representatives, and today's webinar is part of that training. NORC developed an issue brief, which is one of the handouts, that sets the stage for ensuring ombudsman representatives are following the rule. It has questions like, do your policies and procedures address standards for prompt response to complaints? Do you prioritize abuse, neglect, exploitation, and time-sensitive complaints? Do you consider the severity of the risk of the resident? Do you consider the imminence of the threat of harm to the resident? Do you consider the opportunity for mitigating harm to the resident through ombudsman services, kind of like the issue that Louise mentioned with the caretaker. Are there procedures for access to records relating to complaint process, and do they address accessing to review records related to an ombudsman with the informed consent and communicated and documented, and access to reviewing residents related to a resident without consent? And those are going to be important policies and practices and procedures that each program is going to need to have. When access is necessary to invest a complaint, and the resident cannot give consent and the resident representative refuses to consent, when and how does the ombudsman representative get approval from the state ombudsman to pursue a complaint? And Louise had a couple of those instances where in order to take action, the representative needed to have permission from that state ombudsman or through policies and procedures. So has that been set up? And if so, how does that work? And if not, then boy, somebody's starting a to-do list. I can just feel it right now. This issue brief would make a very good handout for any training that you do, either as homework or to be parts of it to be read during the training. In the training, a key concept is that the resident is in control and that the role of the ombudsman is to serve the resident. Empowerment is a key factor in the work that ombudsmen do. And again, Louise mentioned this earlier, that it's not up to the ombudsman to go do, it's for the ombudsman to see if they can provide information, provide guidance, provide support for that resident to be able to handle their own issues, and only to proceed on their own if the resident wishes them to do that. Getting permission of the resident may mean having a form which the resident signs. Does your program have that? And are representatives being trained to get consent? For many programs, this more formal asking permission will be a change. You may want to consider having representatives practice by role-playing during training. Keeping the resident involved is key. Ombudsmen need to ensure that representatives are informed of what's happening and ensure that when the case is finished, that the resident indicates that they are satisfied with the result. And that may be a new step for some programs. You know, it's always more difficult when a resident can't communicate. How will you determine whether the resident has a durable power of attorney or a guardian whom you should be talking to? Again, this may be a new step for you. In the past, you may have gone ahead and investigated an issue without getting permission from the resident's representative. Now the rule is directing you to seek that permission, and without alerting the home that you are potentially working with a particular resident, how you find out who that resident representative is. This is a topic that probably needs to be discussed with the state ombudsman and state staff and state staff representatives to ensure that all the programs are acting consistently. This reminds me of the many times calls came in from a concerned family member, and upon investigation it turned out that there was another family member who was in control. And I can see some of you nodding your heads. The ombudsman would find themselves drawn into that family squabble. Having written policies and procedures may help avoid those kinds of situations in the future. I mentioned earlier that NORC is developing a training guide and toolkit, and that will be coming out soon. This is a sample agenda which begins with resident-directed care, and we start with what does resident-directed advocacy mean to the training participants. You might follow this by asking how they demonstrate resident-directed advocacy in handling complaints. Ask, what does the Older Americans Act say about investigating complaints and access to residents and records? Why is resident-directed advocacy so important? And again, goes back to the trust and credibility of the program. And then asking participants what could happen if the Ombudsman takes a shortcut during the investigation and resolution process. And where does that leave that Ombudsman, and where does that leave the program? This case could be a part of the toolkit. You receive a call from Ginger Smart, whose mother, Mrs. Wilder, lives in hometown facility. Ginger says her mother never has enough to eat and wears several layers of clothing because her room is freezing. Ginger wants you to intervene because her mother thinks Ginger is too pushy. Boy, again, this is like not even a made-up story. And is trying to run her life. When you visit Mrs. Wilder, she says things are fine. She's never eaten large meals. She's a grazer. She's a grazer. And her roommate joins in the conversation, supporting what Mrs. Wilder says. Mrs. Wilder looks healthy to you. The room is a little cool, but Mrs. Wilder says she likes wearing a sweater. So at this point, Katie, would you open the next polling question? So when you follow up with Mrs. Smart, she gets angry and says you've been duped by an old lady with Alzheimer's. After all, Ginger is the power of attorney for her mother and the responsible party. How do you respond? Say you'll make another visit and apologize for not getting the whole story. Ask Ginger to sign a consent form for you to intervene on behalf of Mrs. Wilder. Inform Ginger about residents' ability to choose. Suggest ways for her to document her observations to resolve the problems, and leave the door open for her to call you at another time. Or tell Ginger that you work on behalf of residents and Mrs. Wilder has directed you not to act. This might be a really good role play for your representatives to see how they might handle this conversation. Okay, Katie, could you share the results, please?
Sure. So 3% said that they'll visit again and apologize for not getting the whole story. 2% said that they would ask Ginger to sign a consent form, giving you permission to act. 46% said that they would inform Ginger about residents' ability to choose. And 49% said that you would tell Ginger that you work on behalf of residents and you've been told not to act.
Okay, well, we seem to be all over the place, and you know, every case is going to be different, and one of the downsides of any kind of role play is bringing in past things and saying, how did I fix it last time, and is that going to work this time? And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. I think actually this case is probably pretty typical when we get a phone call and we go out and do an investigation. There's probably not a right or wrong answer. The best answer is probably C, but which kind of is more of a, for those of us that kind of don't want that up in your face confrontation, but there's nothing wrong with D, to tell people that you work on behalf and that she's asked you not to direct. That nothing wrong with that. There's actually nothing wrong with A or B other than you're setting yourself up for failure, since the resident has already told you not to intervene, and I'm not sure what you're going to do if you make another visit. So this again would be a good conversation to have with your representatives, and to maybe do that role play to see how people would respond. NORC has a lot of resources on the topic of complaint handling. Experienced ombudsmen can refresh their skills and explore more complicated situations by applying the questions asked in the teaching notes of the NORC curriculum, which is on the Ombudsman NORC website. It's the problem-solving process investigation and resolution, and the basic complaint handling skills for ombudsman, a training guide. And if you've not looked at those documents lately, certainly would point you to the North curriculum modules. And this particular guide here is another one of your handouts, which would be good to read and discuss during any training on this topic. And this goes over the information that Louise just mentioned on allegations of abuse, and it's we're going to have Jan explore this issue a little bit more. Katie, will you open the last polling question? And to be perfectly honest, I didn't write down what this last question, this last question, pretty sure, is whether or not you have any training materials or you've developed anything that you're using to teach yourself or to teach other people how to do complaints. We'd like to kind of have an idea of who's developed stuff, and then we would ask if you would like to share that with the Ombudsman Resource Center. We would love to collect examples and put perhaps put several of them on our website as examples so that other people could see what you're doing. So, Katie, what's the result of this poll?
31% said yes and 69% said no.
Okay, well, those 39% of you, if you wanted to consider sharing whatever you might have developed with us, we would, we're certainly always open to looking at what's out there and posting some of those materials on our website. I, at this point, just will point out that the next 2 or 3 slides are other resources on this topic of complaint handling. This is the information from the curriculum. And these are other resources. What was the word? These are other resources that also talk about resident-directed work, and especially this hand-in-hand video is something that was developed for all nursing homes. And then there's an ombudsman tip sheet that talks to you about how you might use this video and perhaps use it as part of your training. So at this point, I'm going to, I'm going to turn things over to Jan, and we'll see what happens next. So Jan, thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
No, but it may just be me.
Showing it. There we go. How about now?
Yes, now I can. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Well, good afternoon to everyone, and I want to thank Consumer Voice and the National Ombudsman Resource Center staff for asking us to participate on the webinar. We've been asked to address some of the changes that we're putting in place in Pennsylvania surrounding our training on the final federal rule and abuse reporting in particular. These are some of the items that we identified as necessary when planning on rolling out our training on the changes to the way we handle abuse reporting and investigation. We'll explore them all in greater detail, but for now, some of the things that we considered were, what is your previous process for abuse reporting or case investigation? Do you need to retrain your ombudsman thought process on how they report abuse? Why is the final federal rule insisting we handle abuse this way? And Louise covered that, and also its benefits. how to develop materials, who's your audience, is it seasoned ombudsman, new ombudsman, staff, or volunteer, and then changes and obstacles, and also volunteer implications. We knew that our volunteers needed to receive the same training. We're lucky that we have two entities that handle abuse reporting in Pennsylvania. In the past, an ombudsman was always encouraged to work at the consumer's direction, and we would only report to protective service without consent in a situation that could impact the safety and well-being of other consumers in the home. For example, if we entered a facility and we were told about physical abuse of a resident, we would report even if the resident refused, as other folks could be potentially harmed by the perpetrator. This is different from the federal final rule, which requires us not to report without consent. Our ombudsman had some difficulties at first with this concept when we rolled it out a year ago at our annual training conference, and we were faced with many what-ifs. The bottom line is that the final federal rule is trying to protect the purity of the ombudsman-client confidentiality. If a resident tells you about abuse, we're only reporting it if they ask us to. Better yet, we're hoping that they will be reporting it because we empowered them to. This is a new frame of mind for some folks and can be very confusing, especially when we're talking about abuse. Many folks who work in our program hold mandatory reporting requirements from other places, such as employees of the Area Agency on Aging or some professional network, such as licensed nurses or social workers. So how do we deal with these? Our training focuses on that you are an ombudsman and that is your only role. So that folks that were finding that hard to be a conflict for them, that they may not be able to perform the function as required as an ombudsman. We train as to the reason and the purpose of not being mandated reporters, the maintaining confidentiality, building that rapport with the consumer, enhancing trust, and enhancing credibility. When an ombudsman program receives any complaint, including but not limited to an abuse-related complaint, it investigates solely for the purpose of gathering necessary information to resolve the complaint to the resident's satisfaction. It does not investigate in order to officially determine whether any law or regulation has been violated or for the purpose of taking official protection, regulatory, or enforcement action. This goal of the investigation is to resolve the complaint to the resident's satisfaction, but not to substantiate whether the abuse or other allegations occurred. This is directly from the final federal rule, and as Louise mentioned it before, I just felt it was really important for it to sink in for all of us. It's a very important statement on investigation for the ombudsman in abuse cases. We're not the finders of fact held to substantiate the abuse. The final federal rule does not preclude us from also conducting our investigation concurrently with protective service either. Perhaps our role is connecting the consumer with protective service entity and making sure that they are satisfied with the outcome. We would still see this as a case as we're empowering the resident, making sure they're aware of available support services, and working with them to develop a plan of action for resolution and then providing a follow-up visit. We completed a true-false quiz of 9 questions for our training for our attendees to complete. We provided very short time for them to answer, and we just read the question out quickly and had the participants hold up a sign that said true or false. This quiz was also given as one of your handouts for today. Ombudsmen are not mandated reporters. As a trainer, we were prepared to spend some time on this discussion. Many of our ombudsman staff and volunteers have had other roles prior to becoming an ombudsman where they were mandated. So we explained that their focus must be their role as an ombudsman, that mandatory reporting damages the trust and confidential relationship that the ombudsman builds with their clients, and that sharing information with protective services can cause us to have a bias when we're working with our clients. We provided a final rule tip sheet handout and explained that these were clarifications from the final rule. We also developed a handout of a 5-step process to abuse reporting, which I'll share with you shortly. We explained to the participants that residents may need time to agree to reporting the abuse, that many residents are afraid of retaliation. With this type of fear, they're unwilling to take a chance to report. And again, remember, we as ombudsmen go home each evening, and those residents have to live in that facility. How often are clients and residents unwilling to report? There are actually few times, if you spend adequate time working with someone and providing them with the support, that they will refuse to allow you to report or report themselves. In those cases, we must honor their wishes. This doesn't mean that we don't work with them. We do. And we try from the ombudsman side to resolve the issue to the best of our ability. So this is our 5 steps to reporting abuse. So first we have, you receive it. You receive the report. So who do we receive these abuse reports from? It could be the resident, the staff, a family member, a friend, or somebody else. But what we want to remember is resident direction first and foremost, and that we're always going to go back to that resident. Next is support. This is the time to support the resident and build rapport and trust. You want to use your listening skills, encourage residents to talk using open-ended questions, and take as much time as necessary during this support, during this step. The next one is empower. This is the time to encourage and empower the resident to self-report abuse. Discuss the importance of abuse reporting. You want to discuss the impact to the other residents, and also explain that there are protections against retaliation. And next is permission. This is the time to obtain that permission from the resident to report. You want to discuss confidentiality, emphasize that you won't report without their consent, discuss that you'll be there throughout the process, and explain the process and the expectations for the investigation. Then and only then would we report to PS, and that is when we receive that permission. If we do not receive the permission, then we want to go back up to that support and empowerment and try to work through that again in hopes that at some point they will want to report the abuse. Next, what we did was we broke up our group into small groups. And depending on the size of the group, there should be no more than 6 people in a group. And we had our groups go over some scenarios that we came up with and discussed. And we asked them to focus on the obstacles first that they would face in their potential scenario. Then we had them address the strategies that they might use to reduce or eliminate those obstacles. And we had them record their answers on a worksheet. We told them that nothing was off base in the discussion, that it could be increased visibility to the facility, maybe training for the residents and facility staff might be an option, or assigning a volunteer who worked with the residents and saw them more often to build up that rapport. And these are just a few of the samples. So we had the groups report back on both of those topics for each of the scenarios. And this also is provided as one of the handouts for today. We felt that this was a great way to see if our trainees were getting it and where else we may needed to add on and work on some more additional training. That's actually all I have for you today, and thank you all very much.
Well, Jan, thank you. As Katie gives me control back, this is wonderful information because it shows a real life, you know, kind of what you guys did in response to the rule. So I thank you and the Pennsylvania program for sharing with us today. Just a reminder that this is the first in a series of 2 webinars. We'll have the second one on April the 25th, and it will be focusing on identifying and addressing individual conflicts of interest as defined by the new rule. At this point, would like to ask Katie and Amity. I'm assuming that we got some questions typed into the question box on the toolkit. So if you could raise the question, we'll get all the speakers prepared to give brief answers.
Sure. Thanks, Carol. This is Amity, and we do have some questions. The first one is that it says, in some areas, the Ombudsman program participates in multi-department review groups around abuse. Is there anything that precludes the Ombudsman from participating in this type of activity under a memorandum of understanding? It is usually APS or the law enforcement entity that brings the review of a case to the table.
This is Louise. Yeah, this is Louise, and I understand how helpful those are, and I'm just thinking on my past experience, I begin to wonder when it's a resident or anybody, you know, kind of, I started to feel with sometimes that it was, well, does the person know that this is happening, the resident, or sometimes it was not in a facility? What are their thoughts on this? And so sometimes it was more around somebody who was defined as difficult, and therefore that led to some abusive practices, so, or abusive care or abusive situations. So I started to, before I left the program, started to think more about that. And so now I would say that when it is a resident, I think it would be important to get that resident's consent to participate in that discussion, or ask the leader of the meeting to redact identifying information out of respect for that person. So that would be one option. You know, and ideally it is the identifying information is redacted, so it's a case study, but it doesn't necessarily have to have, you know, all the details about the person. So that would be one option. But I think there have been circumstances in hindsight where I think, you know, we really should let the resident know, and because in cases where they can express their wishes and ask you know, for their permission to participate, in a sense, you're representing that resident at the table and their perspective. So I understand the importance of those kinds of meetings to learn from, but I also think when possible, consent should be, you should get that consent, or ask that all kind of identifying information be redacted. And I think some multidisciplinary teams take different approaches and might do that. They might redact the information. It still might mean everybody around the table knows who you're talking about, but yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you. Amity, next question.
Okay. When APS contacts the Ombudsman for assistance in an investigation, would we need the resident's permission before responding?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Sure. Okay. When APS contacts the Ombudsman program for assistance in an investigation, would we need the resident's permission before sharing information?
The short answer would be yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. And this question is for Jan. Jan, were the group exercises done with all staff or staff and volunteers?
They were done with staff and volunteers.
Great. Thank you. One more question. There are many definitions of abuse. In one of the handouts for the webinar, it provided a definition, but it was somewhat vague. Does the rule define abuse?
Does the rule define abuse? No. The rule does not define abuse. There are the abuse codes and NORs, that, ombudsmen use. And so that would be kind of in terms of how you would describe abuse in for NOR's purposes that way. You're also kind of looking at the context of your state laws. Abuse is defined in the nursing home regulations. So that, there are many different definitions of abuse, but I think there are those common themes: physical abuse, sexual abuse, and then the definitions may have some variation. But the Ombudsman Program Rule does not define abuse.
Thank you. Another question, please briefly discuss the procedure to investigate records if the complainant or the resident asks to remain anonymous.
Well, I don't know, Jan, if you have any insights. I think that would be difficult.
Well, this is Carol. One way is to look at multiple people's records. Maybe 2 or 3 people on a particular wing, or that goes with anytime you're in a home and you're talking to people. It's always best to visit with several people rather than just come in, talk to one person, and then leave. And then the next time you come in, you have an issue or something that people can pinpoint who you are speaking on behalf of, if you are needing to do it without raising a name. But yeah, Jan, do you have some thoughts there?
Yes, Carol, that's exactly what we do, is that we would pull multiple charts, but we would only look at the person's chart that we have permission to look at. And we also would go and visit several residents so that the staff would not know. Now, it is becoming more challenging now with some electronic records, but we're still trying to work through that issue. But that's what we do, is we pull several files.
So just to follow up on that, so I think what I'm hearing though is, so with looking at residents' records, you need their consent, and there's some exceptions where you don't. So with any record you'd look at, there needs to be consent. If you have a resident who wants assistance with a complaint, and it sounds like it's possibly related to care issues, but they say, I want to be anonymous, I think part of that is trying to educate the resident on your approaches will be limited, because you can't, if you have to look at the record, you've got to identify the resident. And so what are the strategies to help that resident feel more secure? Would it even be stepping back and saying, well, who would you feel comfortable with in terms of talking to the staff? Which staff do you feel comfortable with? Could we have a meeting, like a care conference? So I think, you've got to use some, again, with accessing records, you've got to have consent of any resident. So that could make more.
Thanks. Thank you, Louise, for saying that. This is Amity. I'm glad Louise covered that, because I also kind of wanted to reflect back to Louise's slides about that scenario with the janitor in the home, and how indirectly that resident was impacted because the Ombudsman shared that information without consent. So you have to kind of think of that similarly when you would look at records without consent. Even if you're pulling them and not looking at them, there still could be some kind of fallout, because you're asking for those records and the names obviously attached to it, and you're sharing that with the staff. So
this is Jan. I just wanted to comment too that most of the time, and probably a very large percentage of the time, and this is what we train and we tell our ombudsman, is that those records don't give you the information that you need. Very seldom would we ever need to pull a record, and in Pennsylvania we do not pull them very often at all. But if we did, you know, if there was something and the resident really wanted to, and we would certainly explain all of that too, to try to first get them to want to agree for the staff to know who they are. But as a last resort, that's what we would do. But it's certainly not very often.
So we are at 4:15. However, we do have a few more questions, and I think this is a really important conversation. So if we could ask the presenters, if you don't mind, to stay on just for a few more minutes, and if the attendees wouldn't mind just maybe another 5 minutes or so to address a couple more questions, I'd appreciate it. Another question we received was, what would you advise an ombudsman to do if they actually witness physical or verbal abuse?
Anybody want to take that?
Oh, go for it, Louise.
So I think when I was in Washington State, we had some instruction on this, and I hope this doesn't happen too often where the ombudsman would be in that situation. But if you're witnessing it actually happening, one thing is to make a lot of noise, you know, holler. Sometimes that verbal noise will get the person doing the abuse to stop. You don't want to try to physically break up a fight. You could get hurt yourself. And I think this is one where, you know, with because of the kind of urgency of the situation, you do want to get immediate attention to the resident who's been potentially harmed. So, you know, even as simple as can I get help, you know, and staff need to respond to these kinds of things. You say if it's a resident-to-resident issue, clearly if it's a staff-to-resident issue, staff have a responsibility to intervene and address the problem and do their mandatory reporting, etc. So part of it, I think, is just drawing attention to get some immediacy to the situation. And I hope this doesn't happen too often, because it is one where you don't have a lot of time, and your first, if your first instinct is to try to break it up, don't, but verbally make noise and draw attention to it, and staff need to get engaged immediately to address the issue. And then you want to get to the residents who have been impacted, and also to contact the state ombudsman as soon as possible.
Thanks, Louise. The technical assistance guide, the responding to allegations of abuse, role and responsibilities of the Ombudsman program that Carol mentioned in her slides, and there's a link to it. That guide actually provides some scenarios, and one of them is a situation when an ombudsman witnesses abuse. So I encourage you to look at that guide, use that, start incorporating it in your training, and it'll help walk through that process, very similar to what Louise just shared. And of course, the language in the rule, there is some language in the rule now talking about witnessing abuse. So Carol, I'm going to pass it back to you. Thank you for all your wonderful questions.
Great, yes, thank you all, and thanks for attending today's webinar on complaint handling. Please feel free to reach out to any of the speakers or to NORC if you have questions or comments about this topic or anything else related to Ombudsman work. And goodbye for now.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.